The air inside the abandoned building was thick with dust and decay. Three tourists had wandered off the main road, drawn by curiosity and the crumbling architecture that hinted at a forgotten past. Sunlight barely penetrated the broken windows, casting long shadows across floors littered with debris. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing through empty hallways. When one of them paused, there was a sound faint, almost imperceptible coming from below. They found the basement entrance half hidden behind a collapsed doorframe. The wooden stairs groaned under their weight as they descended into darkness, using their phones as makeshift flashlights. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying a smell they couldn't quite place something animal, something wrong. And then they heard it again, breathing, slow and labored, rising from the shadows ahead. The beam of light swept across the room and stopped. In the far corner, barely visible against the stone wall, was a lion. He lay motionless on the concrete floor, his body pressed against the cold surface as if he'd given up trying to escape it. A thick metal chain ran from a rusted collar around his neck to a bolt in the wall. His ribs jutted sharply beneath matted golden fur, and his eyes, once fierce and wild, stared blankly into nothing. For a moment, no one spoke. The shock of it stole their words, their breath, their ability to process what they were seeing. This wasn't supposed to exist here, in this forgotten place. In this cruel silence, a lion, chained, alone. The tourists exchanged glances, horror and disbelief written across their faces. One of them took a step closer, and the lion's ear twitched, the only sign that he was aware of their presence. His body was skeletal, his coat dull and lifeless. The collar had worn deep grooves into his neck from years of pressure, and the chain itself was corroded, evidence of time passing without mercy. He didn't growl, he didn't move. He simply lay there, as if waiting for nothing, expecting nothing. The breathing continued, shallow, rhythmic, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. They stood frozen, trying to comprehend how something so majestic could have been reduced to this. How long had he been here? How had no one known? They stood in the dim basement, their flashlights illuminating the lion in fragmented beams. He hadn't moved since they'd found him. His massive frame, once built for power and grace, now looked fragile against the cold concrete. His breathing was the only movement, a slow rise and fall of his ribcage that seemed to require all the strength he had left. The tourists remained still, afraid that any sudden motion might startle him, though deep down they wondered if he even had the energy to be startled anymore. One of them, a woman named Sarah, crouched down slowly, her eyes fixed on the lion's face. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he'd stopped seeing the world around him long ago. She noticed the metal collar first, how it pressed into the fur around his neck, leaving bare patches where the skin had worn raw. The rust had stained his coat in streaks of orange and brown, evidence of years spent in this position, this prison. The chain itself was thick and heavy, anchored to the wall with a lock that looked as old as the building itself. Her companions whispered behind her, debating what to do, whether to call someone, whether it was even safe to be this close. But Sarah couldn't look away. She saw the way his paws rested limply on the floor, claws dulled and cracked. She saw the hollowness in his face, the way his eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her. This wasn't aggression. This wasn't danger. This was surrender. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed emergency services. Her voice was steady when she spoke, explaining what they'd found, where they were, how urgent it was. But as she hung up, she realized that waiting wasn't enough. This lion had waited for years without food, without care, without hope. She couldn't ask him to wait any longer. Sarah turned to the others and said the words quietly, but firmly, "We're getting him out of here." There was no hesitation in her voice, no room for doubt. The others nodded, understanding settling over them like a shared weight. They didn't know how, and they didn't know what would happen next. But they knew they couldn't leave him chained to that wall for even one more hour. Sarah took a careful step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The lion's ear flickered at the sound of her footfall, and his body tensed just barely, just enough to show that some part of him still registered threat. But he didn't lift his head. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He simply flinched, a weak tremor that ran through his emaciated frame before settling back into stillness. It was the reaction of an animal too exhausted to defend himself, too broken to even try. She stopped where she was, her heart tightening in her chest. Up close, the full extent of his condition became painfully clear. Every rib was visible beneath his coat, pressing against the skin like bars of a cage he carried within himself. His fur, once golden and magnificent, was matted with dirt and neglect, clumped together in patches where moisture and time had stolen its luster. His breathing was shallow, each inhale a labored effort that seemed to cost him more than he had to give. Behind her, one of the other tourists whispered something about calling animal control, about getting professionals involved. But Sarah barely heard him. She was focused on the lion's eyes, those dull, faraway eyes that told a story no words could capture. This wasn't recent cruelty. This was years of abandonment, years of lying in the dark with nothing but the cold floor and the weight of the chain. She thought about how long 8 years was. How many days? How many nights? How many times he must have listened to footsteps above him, hoping someone would come. The realization settled over all of them like a heavy fog. This lion had been forgotten, left behind when the building was abandoned, or hidden intentionally, trapped in a place no one thought to look. No one had fed him properly. No one had cared for his wounds. No one had freed him. He had survived on scraps, on rainwater that seeped through cracks, on shearwool that was now almost extinguished. Sarah crouched down again, this time staying at a distance that felt safe for both of them. She spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to help you. I promise." The lion didn't respond. He didn't understand her words. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and the pain, maybe some small part of him felt the shift in the air, the presence of something different, something kind. One of the tourists, a man named Marcus, disappeared back up the basement stairs while Sarah and the third member of their group stayed with the lion. They could hear him moving through the rooms above, opening doors, searching through debris. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the sound of the lion's breathing. Then Marcus returned, carrying a pair of old bolt cutters he'd found in what must have been a maintenance storage room. The handles were worn, the metal spotted with rust, but they were solid enough to work. Sarah nodded at him, and together they approached the lion. She spoke softly as they moved, her voice low and steady, hoping that the tone alone might communicate what her words could not. "It's okay. We're here to help. You're going to be free." The lion's eyes followed them, tracking their movements with an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope. It was something in between a wary confusion, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would come closer instead of walking away. Marcus knelt beside the chain, positioning the bolt cutters around the rusted lock. The lion shifted slightly, his muscles tensing beneath his thin frame, but he didn't pull away. Perhaps he was too weak. Perhaps he simply didn't believe anything would change. Marcus squeezed the handles together, applying pressure, but the lock held firm. Years of corrosion had fused the metal together, making it stubborn and unyielding. He adjusted his grip and tried again, his jaw set with determination. Sarah kept talking, filling the silence with gentle reassurance. She told the lion about the sky he would see again, about grass and open space, about a life beyond these four walls. She didn't know if any of it was true yet, but she needed to believe it was possible. The lion watched her, his gaze steady now, something flickering behind the dullness, a fragment of awareness, perhaps, or the faintest echo of curiosity. Marcus grunted with effort, his knuckles white against the handles of the cutters. The lock resisted, groaning under the pressure, metal grinding against metal. Flakes of rust fell to the concrete floor like ash. He repositioned once more, finding a weak point in the corrosion, and bore down with everything he had. The lock still held, but Sarah could see it beginning to give. Just a little more, just a little longer. The lock gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the basement. Marcus stumbled back slightly from the force of his final effort, and the heavy chain slipped free from the broken lock, falling to the concrete floor with a clang that seemed to reverberate through the entire room. The sound was final, absolute, the sound of something ending. For the first time in 8 years, the lion was no longer bound to the wall. Sarah held her breath, waiting for him to react. She expected him to stand, to shake off the chain, to take even one step toward the freedom that now lay open before him. But the lion didn't move. He remained exactly as he had been, his body pressed against the cold floor, his head resting on his paws. The collar still hung around his neck, loose now without the weight of the chain, but he made no attempt to remove it. His eyes blinked slowly, registering the change but not understanding it. Marcus stepped back, giving the lion space, and the three tourists stood in silence, watching. The absence of the chain felt enormous, like a presence removed rather than a weight lifted. But the lion seemed unaware of what it meant. He had spent so long in that exact position, restricted to the length of the chain, that freedom had become an abstract concept, something that no longer existed in his world. He had forgotten how to move beyond the small radius that had defined his entire existence. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had expected relief, maybe even joy, but instead she felt a deep, aching sadness. Freedom wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the ability to recognize that you were no longer bound, the willingness to believe that movement was possible again, and this lion had been robbed of that. He lay there, unmoving, as if the invisible walls of his captivity were still in place, as solid as the stone around them. One of the tourists whispered, "Why isn't he getting up?" Sarah shook her head, unable to answer. She understood, though. She understood that freedom takes more than a broken lock. It takes time, patience, and the gradual remembering of what it feels like to choose your own path. The lion was free now, but he didn't know it yet. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest part of all. Sarah found a cracked ceramic bowl in the corner of the basement, half buried under rubble. She wiped it clean with the edge of her shirt and climbed back up the stairs to find water. There was a working tap in what remained of the building's ground floor, and she filled the bowl carefully, watching the water swirl with a few particles of dust before settling clear. When she returned to the basement, Marcus and the other tourist had moved back, giving the lion more space, their phones casting soft light across the dim room. She approached slowly, crouching low as she set the bowl down within the lion's reach. The sound of water sloshing against the ceramic caught his attention. His nostrils flared slightly, processing the scent, and for the first time since they'd freed him, he moved. It was barely perceptible, a shift of his head, a slight extension of his neck, but it was movement born of intention rather than reflex. His eyes focused on the bowl, and something changed in his expression. The lion stretched his muzzle forward, his movements slow and uncertain, as if testing whether this was real or another cruelty disguised as kindness. His tongue emerged, dry and rough, and touched the surface of the water. He pulled back for a moment, as though surprised, then lowered his head again and began to drink. The lapping was quiet, tentative, his tongue trembling with the effort. He drank in small amounts, pausing between each swallow, his body too weak to take more at once. Sarah sat back on her heels, watching him with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. The others remained silent, honoring the moment for what it was, the first act of care this lion had received in who knew how long. As he drank, something shifted in his posture. He lifted his head slightly higher than before, just a fraction, but enough to notice. His ears, which had been flat against his skull, twitched forward. The dullness in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a faint glimmer of awareness, as if a light that had been extinguished was trying to flicker back to life. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and she felt the weight of that gaze. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was recognition, the understanding that something had changed, that he was no longer alone in the darkness, that the world had shifted in a way he couldn't quite name. The wildlife authorities arrived within the hour, their van pulling up outside the abandoned building with quiet efficiency. 2 veterinarians and a rescue specialist descended the basement stairs, carrying equipment and moving with the practiced calm of people who had seen suffering before. Sarah and the others stepped aside, giving them room to work. Though none of them could bring themselves to leave entirely, they stayed near the stairs, watching as the professionals knelt beside the lion. The lead veterinarian, a woman with gray-streaked hair and steady hands, spoke softly as she approached. Her voice was low and soothing, the kind of tone meant to convey safety rather than words. She examined the lion from a distance first, noting the visible ribs, the matted coat, the way his breathing remained shallow even after the water. She pulled out a stethoscope and moved closer, explaining each action before she performed it, as if the lion could understand her intent through the gentleness of her voice alone. The lion watched her but didn't resist. His body remained still as she listened to his heartbeat, checked his gums for signs of dehydration, and ran her fingers carefully along his spine. She spoke quietly to her colleagues, using terms Sarah didn't fully understand: severe malnutrition, chronic dehydration, possible muscle atrophy. But the conclusion was clear enough. He was alive, and that alone felt like a fragile miracle. The trauma was deep, written into every bone and hollow space, but it hadn't claimed him yet. They prepared a transport stretcher, padded and secure, designed to move him without causing further harm. The specialist explained to Sarah that they were taking him to a wildlife sanctuary 2 hours away, a place equipped to handle cases like his cases that required not just medical care, but time, patience, and an environment where healing could happen slowly. The veterinarian carefully fitted a soft muzzle around the lion's face, not out of fear but out of protocol, and together the team lifted him onto the stretcher with remarkable tenderness. The lion's eyes stayed open as they carried him up the stairs, watching the unfamiliar ceiling pass above him, the play of light against walls he'd never seen. Sarah followed behind, her heart caught between hope and sorrow. She didn't know what recovery would look like for him, or if it was even fully possible, but she knew he was leaving this place. And that had to mean something. The sanctuary was nestled in a valley, surrounded by low hills, where the air smelled of earth and wild grasses. The lion was carried to a specially prepared enclosure quiet, set apart from the other animals, designed to minimize stress and provide space for recovery. The ground was covered in soft grass, not the harsh concrete he'd known for so long, and a large oak tree stretched its branches overhead, offering dappled shade from the afternoon sun. A shallow pool of fresh water sat in one corner, and the fencing was barely visible, designed to feel open rather than confining. The caregivers lowered the stretcher gently and stepped back, removing the muzzle with careful hands before retreating to give him space. The lion lay where they'd placed him, his body settling into the grass, with a heaviness that spoke of exhaustion deeper than sleep could cure. He didn't lift his head to explore. He didn't sniff the air or test the boundaries of this new place. He simply remained still, his eyes turned upward toward the sky. It was the first time in 8 years he'd seen it unobstructed: no ceiling, no cracks of light filtering through broken boards, just open sky stretching endlessly above him. Clouds drifted past in lazy patterns, white against blue, and the sunlight fell across his face without the harshness of confinement. The caregivers watched from a distance, understanding written into their patient silence. They knew better than to expect immediate change. Healing wasn't linear, and trust couldn't be rushed. One of them, a man named Thomas who had worked with traumatized animals for over a decade, made quiet notes on a clipboard. He observed the lion's breathing, the way his eyes tracked movement, but his body remained motionless, the subtle signs of awareness mixed with deep withdrawal. Thomas had seen this before: animals so broken by captivity that freedom felt more terrifying than familiar. The lion wasn't ready to move yet. He was still processing the fact that the walls were gone, that the chain no longer held him, that the world had expanded beyond comprehension. The caregivers left food nearby: fresh meat, carefully portioned, but they didn't expect him to eat immediately. They simply made it available and walked away, giving him the gift of solitude. The lion stayed where he was, staring at the sky, his body finally resting on something soft. For now, that was enough. The first few days passed in careful stillness. The lion remained in the same spot, where the caregivers had placed him, moving only when necessary, his body conserving what little energy it had. But on the third morning, Thomas arrived to find that the meat left the night before had been touched. Not all of it was gone, just small portions, torn carefully and consumed in the quiet hours when no one was watching. It was a small victory, but it mattered. It meant the lion's body was beginning to remember what hunger felt like, what nourishment meant. By the end of the first week, his breathing had changed. The shallow, labored rhythm that had marked his rescue had steadied into something deeper, more regular. His ribs still showed prominently beneath his coat, but there was a subtle shift in the way he held himself, less collapsed, more present. Thomas watched from the observation point as the lion lifted his head one afternoon, his gaze following a bird that had landed on the fence. It was a brief moment of focus, of engagement with the world around him, and it filled Thomas with quiet hope. On the ninth day, the lion stood. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a slow, deliberate effort that took several minutes to complete. His legs trembled beneath him, muscles that had atrophied from years of disuse struggling to remember their purpose. He swayed slightly, finding his balance, and then took a single step forward. His paw pressed into the soft grass, testing the ground as if unsure it would hold him. He paused, breathing heavily from the exertion, then took another step, and another. Thomas held his breath, watching as the lion made his way across a small section of the enclosure. It was only a few meters, barely a fraction of the space available to him, but it was movement born of choice rather than necessity. The lion stopped near the pool of water, lowering his head to drink without the trembling that had marked his first taste of freedom. When he finished, he didn't lie down immediately. He stood there for a moment, his body weak but upright, his eyes scanning the horizon beyond the fence. Something inside him was waking up, not fully, not all at once, but gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had been dark for far too long. 3 weeks had passed since the lion arrived at the sanctuary, and the transformation, though gradual, was undeniable. Thomas stood at the observation point in the early morning light, watching as the lion moved through his enclosure with a steadiness that hadn't existed before. The skeletal frame that had defined him in the basement was filling out slowly, muscle returning to his shoulders and haunches. His coat, once matted and dull, had begun to regain its luster, brushed regularly by the caregivers and nourished from within by consistent meals. In the golden sunlight, he almost looked like himself again. The lion stood near the center of the enclosure, his gaze fixed on the open land beyond the fence. The valley stretched out before him, hills rolling into the distance under a sky so vast it seemed endless. There were no chains here, no walls closing in, no ceiling pressing down on his spirit. Just space, real, tangible space, and the freedom to move through it as he chose. He had walked the entire perimeter of the enclosure yesterday, marking it as his own, reclaiming the instinct to patrol and protect that had been stolen from him. He didn't roar. Thomas had wondered if he would, if that deep, primal sound would ever return to signal his full recovery. But the lion remained silent, and Thomas understood that some things didn't need to be announced. The change was visible in other ways, in the way he held his head high, in the confidence returning to his stride, in the alertness of his eyes as they tracked movement in the grass. His posture had shifted from defeat to dignity, from surrender to something that resembled hope. Thomas watched as the lion turned his face toward the sun, eyes half closed, letting the warmth soak into his fur. It was a gesture of contentment, of an animal remembering what it felt like to simply exist without pain, without fear, without the weight of abandonment pressing down on every breath. The lion took a slow breath, his chest expanding fully, and exhaled with a calmness that spoke of peace beginning to take root. He was alive, not just surviving, but alive in the truest sense, aware of himself, of the world around him, of the possibility that life could be more than endurance. And in that quiet moment, standing in the sunlight with nothing binding him, the lion remembered.